Hello and welcome to the fourth part of this series in which we'll take a look at the concept of punctuated equilibrium within languages. But first, let's listen to a couple of creationists and see what they think about it.
Whether they were ancestors of anything else.
The evolutionists realized that they can no longer rely on the fossil record to give them any support. So what they've done is they've come up with a very crafty alternative to the Darwinian concept of evolution. They call it punctuated equilibrium.
The theory says evolution is stable for long periods of time. Then new species suddenly come into being, and others immediately become extinct.
You see, this solves all kinds of problems intellectually for the evolutionist. He doesn't have to look at the fossil record.
I'm convinced that the idea of punctuated equilibria is really a desperate attempt to salvage evolutionary theory. There is no evidence in the fossil record that one type of animal ever changed into another type of animal. Punctuated equilibria comes along and says that isolated populations of animals evolved rapidly and left no fossil trace. But this is an argument from lack of data. There are no transitional forms, and that's used then as proof of the brand of evolution called punctuated equilibria. This is bad science.
Geneticists.
Putting aside all the ridiculous nonsense at the beginning and end, it's nice to see creationists getting a fact right for a change. Punctuated equilibrium says evolution is stable for long periods of time. Then, new species come into being and others become extinct. Is partly right. What Folger and Doc Morris conveniently forget to mention is that this described immediance can only happen if the environment changes so drastically that the here undefined species have to run in order to keep up with the changes thrust upon them. Or to put it in a way that makes more sense, punctuated equilibrium states that when an organism's environment stays stable, organisms remain stable. If the environment changes, evolutionary changes happen very quickly in response. So, what does this have to do with languages? Well, in this case, we have to find the lingual equivalent to the biological environment, which allows a specific language or dialect to make quick and radical changes in its vocabulary. In our language case, the environment is represented by a different culture, the B culture, that joins with the culture that is thus due to make alterations to its vocabulary. That would be the A culture. A good example for this is the Mayan word for coffee, which is ka'apeh. The word coffee originated in the Arabic ka'fe, as well as the Turkish kahve. In the 1700s and 1800s, when coffee was introduced to Spain and Latin America, the Turkish café became the Spanish el café. So, how did café become café? Well, since there is no F in the Mayan language, and a W, I guess, was considered as sounding too soft, the Spanish café, with hard F, transformed into the Mayan café. Other novelty creations are rather quaint, such as the Israeli word Zahnati, which is derived from the German Zahnarzt, meaning dentist in English. However, an interesting example of this punctuated equilibrium within languages is found when we take a look at the origin of beer. Ha ha, very funny. Come on. Bring in good stuff now. There, that's better. More accurately, we're going to take a look at the Mayan word for beer, which is cerveza. Doesn't sound anything like lager or pils, does it? Well, actually, the roots of cerveza lie not in the Spanish or German, but rather in Latin. Before we Germans had perfected the fine taste of malt and hops, the Romans had a beer-like brew they called cerveza. As Rome expanded into the Iberian Peninsula, the local Iberians came into contact with the Roman cervicia and changed it into the later Spanish cerveza. As the Spanish invaded the Mayan kingdoms, they too came into contact with the bitter yellow brew. But, just as with the coffee, pronunciation was rather difficult. For one thing, the Mayan languages have no V, and the C is pronounced as a K. Thus, they worked around it, and thus the cerveza was born, which they spelled S-E-E-R-B-E-E-S-A. However, it doesn't work the other way around, as the Mayan word for cocoa, which is cacao, was introduced into many European languages without many alterations to be needed. This is also true of the Nahuatl word for chocolate, which is chocolatl. Speaking of new vocabularies and conservatives, you know how many conservatives in the US talk about how they want to make the country more American and to be an English-only country? Well, if we take them literally, then conservatives aren't allowed to use the following terms: Jesus, Bible, Amen, and beef. Why? Well, let's break this down, shall we? Jesus is the Latin version of the Hebrew Yeshua. In other words, not English. Amen is merely the English version of the Hebrew Umen, which means so be it. Again, not real English descendant. Bible is again just the English version of the Latin Biblis, which means book, and beef is derived from the French/Normannic bœuf, both of which are not English. So yeah, this whole all-American/all-English posturing is just warm words, as it's impossible to find any language which hasn't changed or altered or deleted words in its vocabulary to match the new cultural and lingual trends. Speaking of trends, in Germany it's become quite popular to say Sinn machen, which is a direct translation from the English to make sense, instead of Sinn haben, Sinn ergeben, which would translate itself into to have sense, to amount to sense. This is part of a new lingual fringe movement, commonly referred to as Denglisch, a composite of the German Deutsch and, well, English. It's essentially German and English mixed together to what most perceive to be an unintelligible gibberish, and has gotten enormous heat for butchering the German language. But honestly, I don't think this is so horrible, especially as this all has its irony to it. As I've demonstrated in the last few videos of this series, German and English are very closely related, so Denglisch can almost be seen as a return to Anglo-Saxon, since this is the common ancestor to both these languages. At this point, I should point out where the discrepancy between Sinn machen and Sinn haben, Sinn ergeben lies. Bastian Sick, who wrote about this lingual oddity, said the following: the word machen originates in the Indo-Germanic mak, which means to knead. The first thing that was therefore made was dough. Yet, something as abstract as sense can't be kneaded. Indeed, this is a good argument, yet I hate to disagree with him on the subject, which is painful for me to say as I really like the book, or in this case of reference, the audiobook. The reason why it's makes sense in English, even though sense is an abstract term, is most likely because of the fact that, although the Anglo-Saxons knew of the abstract concept of sense, this was just as real and profane to them as dough was. At least that's my best take on it. But getting back to Denglish, it's not so modern as most people believe. Indeed, the consumption of English words into German vocabulary is a rather old tradition. A good example of such interlingual gibberish is the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch. And for those of you who don't know much about or have never heard of it, Pennsylvania-Deutsch ist der Spruch von den Mennoniten und Quäker in Wiederdiver, wo im 18. und 19. Jahrhundert von Deutschland in die States noch gemoved sind und sich dort auch gesettelt haben, wo sie da auf ihre Farms Korn und Gemüse auch gepflanzt haben. Well, okay, I can't really do it, and I've added a bit of my own dialect flourish into this, but I hope you get the picture. The last obvious example of punctuated equilibrium, or new foreign words introduced into a language, is when new technologies are introduced. For example, the cell phone. And this is where we also see what crazy creations Denglish has brought forth. For example, the English term for this gadget is mobile or cell phone. The Spanish call it teléfono móvil. And we Germans? Well, believe it or not, the German term for cell phone is handy. I am so not kidding. The German word for the English cell phone is the English adjective for fitting into your hand. Another example of this absurdity is the act of watching a football or a soccer game with lots of people, known in Germany as public viewing. But I'll let German satirist Urban Priol pick up on that one.
Auch so ein Begriff Public Viewing, weil wir ja so stolz sind, dass wir so ein Gefühl für die Sprache haben. Public Viewing wird nur bei uns verwendet, nicht im ethnischen Sprachraum, wo irgendwo was Angelsächsisches ist, weil da war Public Viewing 1, wenn eine Leiche auf dem Holzkarren auf den Marktplatz gefahren wurde, dass Freunde und Verwandte Abschied nehmen konnten. Das nannte man Public Viewing. Gut, hat zum Halbfinale gepasst, aber es...
Yep, folks. This is the kind of absurdity you get in a country where education is the business of 16 different states. How amusing that this is the note this fourth part ends on. I might extend the series to part 5, 6, 7, and so on, but we'll just have to wait and see. I haven't found anything useful as topic for those. So that's all for this part, folks. Don't forget to rate this video, and if you like this series or haven't seen the other parts, go check them out, and if you're nosy, please subscribe.